right now. We would appreciate if you could all have speaker view on your computer. And this is our first event of the season. We welcome you all. We welcome the students. Our interim director and research fellow, Shingy, will be introducing our speaker. I just wanted to mention all of our events are on our website, wellesley.edu/freedom project. And our next one is November 11th. But for now, we will get the meeting started and we welcome you.
Thank you very much, Karen, and good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to our first guest lecture on this rainy evening here in Wellesley. My name is Shingirai, and I'm the interim director of the Freedom Project and also a research fellow. So this is the first of our Freedom Project guest speaker series for this academic year. And in our speaker series, we invite experts on various topics to do with freedom broadly defined, to engage in conversation with our academic community here at Wellesley College and other participants from beyond the college. So this evening, we're very excited to have Jamie Gass give a talk entitled K-12 School Choice and the Liberal Arts Digital Learning During COVID. School choice provides the best possibility for America's K-12 school children to access the high-quality liberal arts curriculum found in excellent public, private, and parochial schools, as well as preparation for higher education. So in this talk, Jamie will discuss a variety of school options, the legal and political barriers to greater choice, and the importance of time-tested academic content in primary and secondary education. He will also discuss the various aspects of digital learning during this period of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'd like to give a brief introduction of Jamie. Jamie is the director of the Center for School Reform at the Boston-based think tank Pioneer Institute that we are proud to have as one of our partners and internship sites. At Pioneer, Jamie has framed, commissioned, and managed over 100 research papers and numerous policy events on K-12 education reform topics, including several with Pulitzer Prize winning historians. Jamie has more than 2 decades of experience in public administration and education reform at the state, municipal, and school district levels. Previously, he worked at the Massachusetts Office of Educational Quality and Accountability as senior policy analyst, technical writer, and in the state budget office under 2 Massachusetts governors. In the 1990s, Jamie worked for the dean of the Boston University School of Education and Boston University management team in its historic partnership with the Chelsea Public Schools. He has appeared on various Boston media outlets as well as talk radio shows throughout the nation. Jamie has also been quoted in Bloomberg, Business Week, The Economist, Education Week, and the Boston Globe. And these op-eds are regularly published in New England newspapers, as well as in the Wall Street Journal, the Weekly Standard, the Hechinger Report, The Hill, the Daily Caller, the Federalist, Education Next, and City Journal. He has won school reform awards in Massachusetts and Florida for his work on U.S. history, civic education, vocational technical school, and digital learning. Jamie also speaks on academic standards, school choice options, and school accountability at events across the country. Welcome, Jamie. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Shingy, for that very generous introduction. And I want to thank Karen and Sirhan and the folks at the Freedom Project for all their good work. It's a real treat to be with you this evening. I should say at the beginning, I grew up out in Western Massachusetts in the town of South Hadley, which is where Mount Holyoke College is. The oldest women's college in the country. And my parents both worked at a women's college at Mount Holyoke for 40 years each. And of course, there are 2 women's colleges, liberal arts colleges, that are in Western Massachusetts and in the Pioneer Valley, Mount Holyoke and Smith. So I have a really great appreciation for the fundamental role that women's education and the liberal arts play in the development of this country and the state and our community. And it's why I really applaud you as liberal arts graduates, because the fact is that the intellectual free exchange of ideas is needed now more than ever. So I'm going to talk with you about, generally speaking, the liberal arts and school choice, with a special focus on the second half on digital or online learning, because it's that particular form of school choice that is most suited for the moment that we're in right now. But to kind of set the table, to kind of give you a sense of the context, to really understand liberal arts is to understand the fundamentals of what our American Republic is really all about, whether it was the founding fathers or people like Abigail Adams, who sent not only her husband and her son to the White House and into public service, but the larger, more literate culture that this country really established in the 18th century was really based in Enlightenment ideals that are central to understanding the liberal arts and the role that that plays in an educated citizenry. All of the founding fathers, much of the founding generation, and even many of the women in that era, Abigail Adams is one, but Mercy Otis Warren, the sister of James Otis, who's considered sort of a pre-revolutionary figure, they were saturated in the world of Bible reading, of Shakespeare, of philosophy, of history, of ancient and modern texts that informed citizenship. And in fact, I think it doesn't go too far to say that you really can't understand the early history of the country or most of the development of the country without understanding what a central role the liberal arts and liberal education has played in its development. And that's even true really of women's education. I mean, Mount Holyoke College was established in 1837. That's really within almost the lifetime of the founding fathers themselves. And it really speaks to a lot of the kind of more egalitarian principles that were unleashed by the American Revolution. As we know, the full universal suffrage and things like that were not initiated during the founding era, but the ideals of it, the idea of people being equal, people having equality of opportunity, was an ideal that was set in motion by that revolutionary generation. And they firmly believed that there was an intimate relationship between a well-educated and virtuous citizenry and self-government, which was the project that they really kind of turned over to posterity for us to carry out and uphold. Now, so the United States unlike most countries, does not actually have a national system of K-12 education or system of higher education that's nationalized. It's all locally and school driven, and in many instances, it's school choice driven. The higher education system in this country is really the envy of the world because of the wide variety of different options, whether they are liberal arts oriented or vocationally oriented or religiously based, but it's totally decentralized. The federal government really plays no role in it. And that's generally true of the K-12 system too. Most of the early state constitutions in this country were very clear in line and verse about how states and localities were the wellspring of education. And it makes sense because that's the way the founders viewed self-government itself. It was something that citizens themselves needed to participate in and control. And so even at this late date, only about 10% of the funding for K-12 education in the United States comes from the federal government, while 90% of it or more, depending on the state, come from the state and local governments. And so there's some lessons there that even in the kind of the constitutional DNA of this country, that local self-government, locally educated and locally enlightened citizenship is really how the country was organized. And that's quite unusual and remarkable. I mean, when there's a famous commentator, Alexis de Tocqueville. He came and visited the United States in the 1830s. He's a Frenchman, sort of aristocratic background. And he said, boy, this is unique. What's going on here is different from what's going on in Europe, where all the decisions are made on high by a ministry or various officials connected with a king or queen or monarch. And that what the United States is doing with locally autonomous, often non-governmental organizations like civic organizations and various religious organizations all create a kind of local dynamic environment that is supposed to support our way of life and the Constitution and the institutions that we've set up. And what he said was so unique about the kind of sacred fire of liberty that we enjoy in this country is that it didn't come from on high. It's protected by constitutions at the state level and at the federal level, but that the business really of civic participation and civic knowledge all is really designed to be encouraged and promoted and represented in our form of government. And so, specifically what the founding fathers, the kind of education that they believed in was that really in a lot of regards, the kinds of education that places like Wellesley College or Mount Holyoke College or these institutions, both public and private, were established, pretty early on in the history of the country. And it was a deep grounding in history and philosophy and literature and math and science. Because the founders were they were children of the Enlightenment. They had started off as British subjects. They were deeply grounded in the classics, so Greek and Latin and Greek and Roman history. Was a big motivator, and it was a big a source of their learning, and they passed that on through all the institutions. A lot of the early schooling was deeply steeped in the classics. It was not, Thomas Jefferson said famously that America is one of these few places where the farmers know about Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad, that they, through, again, local Bible reading, and then later on through newspapers and the dissemination of knowledge through non-governmental organizations like a variety of different kinds of school options, perpetuated this commitment to self-government. But it was one of the main figures of that era, and we still live with these kind of traditions today, was Isaac Newton, the man who in the late 17th and early 18th century revolutionized the world of physics and science. He was a kind of saint, a kind of secular saint to people like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. They were deeply committed to reason and the application of reason and scientific principles in order to solve human problems. But another one of the big figures who's largely forgotten today, and it's kind of a shame, but for 2,000 years, and certainly in the founding era, there was a figure named Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, and he was a kind of an exemplar of this well-educated, civically engaged ancient Roman. He delivered these very fiery and well-written speeches against the growth of centralized power by Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and others. And he was a kind of exemplar. Cicero was a kind of bedtime reading for people in the founding generation. And in truth, it was true of a lot of education in this country. I remember my grandmother, who was a teacher and a principal for 40 years in northern New Jersey, even through the 1970s and the 80s, she always said that it was not unusual for someone delivering a graduation from high school or a commencement speech to start off by saying Cicero said. And it was always this understanding that wisdom and knowledge from antiquity was going to be coming forth, and that was, you better pay attention, because there were things that you could really learn from him about law giving, about public policy, about resisting tyranny, about the importance of public institutions that help honor and uphold liberty. Well, John Adams, who was the author of the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780, he was called the American Cicero. And again, he had that remarkable wife, Abigail, who during the Continental Congress wrote to him around the time of 1776 about remembering the ladies. When you guys are coming up with these laws and thinking about what this future republic is going to look like, he had this very strong-willed, very well-educated wife who was sort of being clear in his mind about what it is that the project was really all about. Well, anyway, John Adams wrote this Massachusetts Constitution. It's the oldest written constitution in continuous use in the world. It predates the US Constitution by 8 or 9 years. And in it is very, very detailed language, as I mentioned, about the importance of education in perpetuating what the founders called the sacred fire of liberty. And that is unique because the federal constitution, there is no mention of it at all, whereas in Massachusetts and New Hampshire and some of these old early constitutions, there's a lot of reference to what John Adams called cherishing education. There's a whole paragraph on embracing literature and history and all of these things serving to educate people. And that is really what formed big reforms that happened in Massachusetts in the early 1990s. So Massachusetts right now is by far the highest performing K-12 public system in the state or in the country. But that was not true 25, 30 years ago. It was a state that always had great public institutions of public education, as well as great private institutions of higher education, Harvard, MIT, Wellesley, Mount Holyoke, Smith, Tufts, et cetera. But it had kind of fallen in hard times, and really sort of the story of the last, 50 years of American K-12 education has been kind of various degrees of stagnation and decline. One of the big reasons I think that that's true is that we kind of, after World War II, began to kind of decline is that there was a shift away from the liberal arts, more towards more of a kind of vocational outlook. Education not preparing so much for citizenship, but education for preparing people for workforce. Now, workforce development and vocational education is important, but it's not the primary objective. It was never the primary objective. And it became kind of faddish after World War II in this country to steer things towards a more skills-based approach. And that led to our gradual and incremental decline. There was a very famous report that was written in 1983 called A Nation at Risk. And it essentially was saying that if we had the system of public education that we have imposed on us, that it would be an act of war, because we had fallen so far behind the high-performing countries like Germany and Japan and the East Asian countries that were really proficient in math and science. So what that report didn't do, though, was prescribe how it should be fixed. It was not going to come from the federal government. And what Massachusetts did in 1993 was set up a big ed reform law. Republicans and Democrats got together, Bill Weld, sort of liberal Republican, Tom Birmingham, and Mark Roosevelt, who was the great grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. Both excuse me, the legislators were Democrats, pretty liberal Democrats, great relationship with organized labor, but all three of them were product of Harvard and elite prep schools or elite parochial schools. And they crafted this grand bargain that basically made for good politics and good policy. They put a lot more additional money into the system, particularly for the poor urban districts, the places like Fall River and New Bedford and Holyoke and Boston, that had high concentrations of kids in need. And so a lot of additional funding was going to be flowing into those districts in exchange for a recommitment to high quality academic standards that were grounded in the liberal arts, the basics of English and math and science and history, as well as a variety of different school choice options, most notably charter public schools. These guys themselves, these legislators, were beneficiaries of school choice. They're either through scholarships to high quality parochial schools or elite prep schools. They wanted to make sure that largely poor and minority kids had access to that same kind of choice, that the participation and having a choice matters a great deal. They experienced it in their lives, and they knew that in a society where people of talent, irrespective of their background, are going to be allowed to rise, that families of all backgrounds, but particularly poor and minority families who don't have as many choices always in education, should have those same kind of choices. And one of the hallmarks of this big ed reform law was these charter schools, which are frankly at this point the highest performing public schools in the United States. Research from Stanford and all of these high quality research studies from elite universities have shown that the charter schools in Massachusetts are doing more to bridge the achievement gaps between urban kids and suburban kids than any group of public schools in the United States. And in fact, a couple years in these high quality charter schools actually gets kids up on par with kids in the wealthiest suburbs, and within a couple of years after that, get them to outperform the suburbs. It is a remarkable story, a remarkable success, but those charter schools have really been grounded in two basic principles: the idea of a rigorous liberal arts education and having access to choice. The choice matters to these kids, and they matter to the families, and that the act of choosing helps them be participants in the securing a really good quality education. And Massachusetts is rightfully very proud of what it has accomplished. As I said earlier, there's an exam, a national test called the NAEP. It's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And it's the nation's report card. It's been around for about 40 years. No state has ever been number one in every category tested, in every grade tested. And going back to 2005, every 2 years, Massachusetts has achieved that. It's like winning the World Series every 2 years and doing it consecutively whenever that test has been applied. And then, as I mentioned, the goal was always to compete with these high performing countries like Germany and Japan and Hong Kong and Singapore. And in 2007 and 2013, Massachusetts tested as its own individual country. It was really the only state to do so. And it was right up there in math and science with Japan and Hong Kong and Singapore. And so it actually had achieved within a relatively 20 years or so, a relatively short period of time. It had achieved that. Well, how did it do it? It did it really by committing to deep reading in classic literature, poetry, and drama. So books like, Edith Wharton, Emily Dickinson, the writings of Frederick Douglass, the writings of the Founding Fathers, the Federalist Papers, the Constitution, all of this rich background knowledge that when you hear presidents or political figures of major parties talking or giving State of the Union speeches, there's always references to the American Revolution or the Civil War or to the abolitionists or to women's suffrage. It's those texts that actually are the common currency or the common language that make sure that people of all backgrounds can understand the language, the common language of our democracy. And that's what those standards that were in classic literature, poetry, and drama, and in hard math and science, that's what Massachusetts did. It's probably for a talk for another day, but unfortunately, a couple of years ago, Massachusetts discarded those. There was a big push for national standards. Many of you folks may have heard of a Common Core. Massachusetts unfortunately adopted the Common Core, which kind of returned it back to this more workforce development, less richness in the liberal arts. And it was something that Pioneer Institute, where I worked, did a lot of work on. We were the ones that were sort of the fire bell in the night saying this is a bad decision. And while Massachusetts is still the highest performing state, it has backslid, it has experienced seriously, serious backsliding since we adopted the Common Core. And it discarded all that rich liberal arts education, which is the reason why Massachusetts went from being about middle of the pack to #1 in the country. But that discussion of Common Core is for another day. I'm going to touch on briefly 2 other areas of school choice. Pioneer's done a lot of work on it. As enlightened as Massachusetts is and has been, and also back in the 19th century passed what they call these anti-aid or know-nothing or Blaine amendments. It's a longer discussion, but essentially nativism took root in the mid-19th century in Massachusetts, and the Know Nothing Party, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic party, took control. They passed a constitutional amendment that prohibited public dollars flowing to parochial and religious school parents under that original Massachusetts Constitution that I talked about. John Adams and the founders really kind of envisioned a free market of schooling where parents and people locally would have access to public schools, but if they wanted to access religiously driven education, they didn't have as much of an issue that we have today between separation of church and state. And this Know Nothing party in Massachusetts in 1854 had huge electoral landslides, and they passed a constitutional amendment walling that off. And so from that time forward, Catholic school parents in particular could not access public dollars, and localities could not subsidize either Catholic or Protestant education. And so just recently, the U.S. Supreme Court, this has been a topic that Massachusetts and Pioneer has been big leaders on. Just this past spring, the U.S. Supreme Court heard a case on this topic, the Espinoza case. It's a story of a single mom from Montana. Montana was one of about 40 states that have these anti-aid or Blaine amendments. She was a homeschool parent first. She became a single mother unexpectedly and wanted her kids to go to a religiously based school out in Montana. That state had a school choice mechanism that made that possible, but the Supreme Court in Montana struck that down. She and her lawyers from the Institute for Justice, appealed that to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they heard the case and sided with her. So now 40 some odd states with these anti-aid or Blaine amendments really have had huge holes ripped in these Blaine amendments, and it will make private school choice, which is really the original intent of the founding fathers at the state level, it'll make it more widely available. That again may be a topic for another day. One of the things I'm going to talk about now, because it really is the kind of school choice mechanism that most meets the moment that we're in. If anyone back in January had told us that we would be using terms like pandemic, or that we'd experience 20% unemployment, or that the economy would be shut down and we'd have conditions that people would be saying mirror the Great Depression, you would have thought it was, that they were crazy. But that is the moment we find ourselves in. And so online learning or virtual learning or digital education is something that all of us are participating in. And in some respects, that's what we're doing right now, is online or digital learning. And Pioneer, going back 10 years, has been a big proponent of this mode of education, not ever saying that it's a panacea or that it's a cure-all, that it will replace traditional education in the relationship between professors and students and teachers and students is important and is central to really what good education is all about. But we know, going back to 2003 in countries like Japan, who experienced the SARS epidemic, that they began to at least prepare their students in the K-12 system for some practice in this, knowing full well that higher education was doing more of this and preparing for the day that there was going to be a future pandemic. Thankfully, we haven't had many of these pandemics. The last one of this scale and magnitude was the 1918 flu epidemic, which killed 50 million people worldwide. Thankfully, the coronavirus is not as lethal as that, although it is much more contagious than the flu epidemic. So I'm going to just talk with you in the second half here of the discussion, and then I'm really looking forward to hearing what your questions are, and I'm glad to answer those. I'm going to talk about online learning. So, the good news is that a state like Massachusetts is this really high-performing state. The bad news of it is that it really lags behind, even now, really lags far behind other states like Florida and Arizona in this area of online learning. And in some respects, that's driven by the fact that Massachusetts has these great charter schools, and it's got the best Catholic schools in the country. And it enacted these enormous reforms that are the envy of the rest of the country, and frankly, puts us into the conversation where we can be competitive internationally. It kind of made the state very complacent about embracing new modes of education like online learning. And so I'm going to talk about a woman who, and from my point of view and from my money, is the best example of what online learning is about. And her name is Julie Young. She was the founder of the Florida Virtual School in 1996. And in fact, one of the leading analysts in this country on K-12 education is a guy named Paul Peterson. He's a professor in the government department at Harvard. He wrote a book in 2011 called Saving Schools from Horace Mann, who was the founder back in the 1830s of American public education until virtual schooling. And he highlighted in this book chapters on Horace Mann and his commitment to the common school. He talked about the importance of equal access to educational opportunity that Dr. King articulated in the 1960s. But he really saw, Paul Peterson really saw Julie Young as in that continuum of people who were genuine pioneers or genuine innovators in K-12 education. And now as 50 million school children in this country are using one form or another of online learning, I think that both Julie Young, but also Professor Peterson were really quite farsighted in this. And in fact, Professor Peterson became familiar with Julie because we at Pioneer Institute have a better government competition that we do every year. It basically enlists ideas from around the country and around the world about how to better provide services. Well, through a collection of judges in our Better Government contest in 2008, Julie Young won our Better Government competition. And that's really when I first met her. And I got to tell you, she is a remarkably impressive educator and impressive woman who, if you're looking for models about people who literally change the world and the work that they do, I'd encourage you to look at Julie Young. In all of her work, starting in 1996, was organized really around this idea that there were no rules and there were no roadmaps to follow. And that was really how she started the Florida Virtual School. It's the first statewide internet-based public high school in the United States. And it's gone on to serve well over 50 million kids, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, 50 states, 68 countries, and 2 million kids worldwide, which is a remarkable accomplishment in a relatively short period of time. And these are students that are gifted and talented. There's kids with special needs, kids with autism, kids that have been bullied, gifted athletes. In fact, the Florida Virtual School's most famous alumna is the Olympic gymnast Allie Reisman. She grew up in right down the road from you folks here at Needham High School, and she graduated in 2012, but she was able to do that because she completed her senior year at the Florida Virtual School while training for the Olympics. And so here's an example of a woman like Julie Young, world-class educator whose work then impacts the education and the career trajectory of a world-class athlete. And Julie and her team really were animated by this central idea that I have to say has been kind of lacking in American public education, which has struggled so much in recent decades. And it's organized on this basic idea. And the basic idea is that you put students at the center of every education policy decision. Now, in school districts across the country, the money really flows from the locality to the school, or from the state to the district and then the school. But one of the things that Julie Young did is that she kind of had the money follow the child, and the education outlook of the Florida Virtual School is that it's highly, highly personalized. So the kids pick the school. The school only gets paid for when the kid completes a course. I'll give you an example. In the city of Boston, about 30% of the kids, there's about 55,000 kids that are enrolled in the Boston Public Schools. But at the end of the 4 years in high schools in Boston, about a third of the kids drop out or do not complete. That's an enormous loss. And yet the school system itself still gets paid for those students that are not completing. That's not the way the Florida Virtual School worked. It worked on the idea that educators only get paid for, and they only get credit for kids that complete the courses. And that's a revolutionary idea, even in higher education, which tends to be kind of more market driven, tend to be more choice driven and decentralized. But it really ensures that the faculty is very much invested in making sure that the kids succeed. Now, sometimes in education, no good deed goes unpunished. I mentioned that as well as Massachusetts has done, there's been a lot of efforts to undermine the charter schools, undermine and provide barriers that block school choice to Catholic schools or Jewish day schools or different kinds of religious education. There's been a lot of pushback on standardized testing, on standards, et cetera. Well, unfortunately, Julie Young also experienced this after 17 years of being at the Florida Virtual School. Local legislators began to peck away at her line item, and she ended up having to lay off about a third of her students, and she retired a few years ago after 17 years of running the Florida Virtual School, and again, making it a model that really was the envy of the rest of the country. And has now moved on. She's the vice president at Arizona State University Digital Prep. And she's really doing the kinds of things at at ASU and this new school that is a kind of embedded within Arizona State University, but has linkages to the K-12 world as well. She's really doing and applying the same kinds of lessons that she did when she was at the Florida Virtual School. But she's a genuine hero, and you should really look into her. You can find her videos online. We've done webinars with her. She has spoken at a variety of different of our events that we've done going back, 10 years or so. And she's just remarkably impressive. And I'm going to kind of just tell you about some of the other ones you folks may either have benefited from or know about. Sal Khan and the Khan Academy. We did an event with Sal Khan in 2011. He started off the Khan Academy, really animated by this idea of doing online tutoring for his niece, I think it was. And in 2012, he was listed as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He sort of joked about it, how doing it early on, through YouTube, he said, YouTube is for cats playing the piano. And yet now, all these years later, I think he's done about 6,500 video lessons on a whole variety of different topics. I think there's 5.5 million subscribers, and they've been viewed 1.7 billion times. And so that's in a relatively short period of time. It's really the last 10 years or so that Sal has been doing that. And he too is an incredibly dynamic and innovative leader in education. But I'm going to talk to you just kind of briefly about Massachusetts. We had, going back, I'd say about 10 years or so, legislation for online learning. Now most of the kids, as I mentioned, are experiencing under COVID some degree of online or digital learning. It's been very slow going in Massachusetts. And I was talking with Karen earlier, and I certainly have experienced that with my two daughters who go to the public schools here in Newton. It's surprising, I think, to parents how a lot of what they're experiencing is not really the kind of ideal that Sal Khan or Julia Young have articulated. And in truth, the best thing is probably a kind of blended of a combination of seat time with online learning, but it has to have a lot of structure to it. We've brought a lot of the leaders. Another big leader is the late Harvard Business School professor, Clayton Christensen. There's a whole center that was established called the Christensen Institute. He was a Harvard Business School professor. He died just a year or so ago. And he's the driver of what they call disruptive innovation, that the idea that things like what Julie Young or Sal Khan have done, that these technologies are disruptive, and they can be disruptive in bad ways, but oftentimes if they're harnessed and directed and organized in productive ways, they can be to the good. And so Massachusetts passed a pretty good quality law here, but the truth of it is that these bureaucracies around education, there's a lot of vested interests, including the state bureaucracy, the State Department of Education, some of the trade groups around education, whether it's at the national level or at the state level. They don't want, education in this country is a $800 billion enterprise. And there's a lot of vested interests that don't really want it to see change very much. They don't want the disruptive innovation, and they work pretty hard through legislators and through public officials and the bureaucracies to stop the kind of innovations that could help provide greater equality of educational opportunity. And that's certainly been the case here in Massachusetts. We have a pretty good law, but the State Department of Education began pretty quickly to ignore the evidence and the recommendations of national experts. So they put a lot of geographic restrictions on online learning. So one of the beneficiaries of this approach to education is that it can reach kids in more rural areas, or kids that are want to access high quality online learning, but maybe in an urban district. They've placed a lot of geographic limitations so that the online learning schools, and we don't have many of them, even at this late date, we only have a couple of them, and they have a lot of caps on their enrollment. The state has been very energetic about kind of handcuffing, frankly, a lot of the innovations in this space. And so, we did a policy paper just this spring, several of them with Julie Young, trying to pass along the best recommendations about how to do it. And you can find those on our website, or I can make those available to Shingy and others, and Karen. But there's a lot of good advice about how to do it and how not to overregulate it. One of them really involves, having a basic understanding of the kind of devices or internet access that parents and families have, and then making financial commitments to make sure that kids that don't have devices, laptops or what have you, have those, and that both the students and the parents and the teachers have the proper training in it. One of the issues that is going on, not just in Massachusetts, but across the country, is that parents and students haven't had a lot of the preparation, and there hasn't been a lot of this connective tissue between teachers and students and parents so that the transition could be done smoothly. We're doing it a little bit on the fly. I mean, no one wakes up in the morning thinking that you're going to have a pandemic, but as I mentioned, countries like Japan, going back to 2003, they had practices. They would have upwards of a month of their regular school year occurring online so that they were able to meet a moment like this one prepared, and that everyone understood, and kind of in the same way that, schools practice fire drills, they also have to practice and understand the kind of procedures that you're going to go through in order to have this. And then districts and schools have to have, they themselves have to be equipped with virtual instruction. That includes a lot of preparation for the teachers. The teachers themselves need to be proficient with the technology. There needs to be a lot of very structured activities that are going on so that their school day online is very much like the school day in the classroom, and that we know whether it's regular learning or whether it's remote learning, is that students, particularly young students, benefit from a lot of structure and a lot of predictability about what the schedule is going to look like. And so that careful programming needs to be a big part of it. And one of the things that people have talked a lot about is that how this is, a lot of kids with special needs, may not be suited for it. It kind of cuts both ways, because in some respects, kids that have emotional troubles or are being bullied or have learning difficulties, some of them actually benefit from the online, more personalized approach. But that too requires a lot of careful work back and forth between the teachers and the families and the students, so that their educational plans are aligned with the special needs that the kids have. But then again, finally, as I said earlier, the daily schedule, I mean, we're all finding this, having a daily predictable schedule helps all of us during this time, but especially kids, particularly younger kids, particularly school age kids in the K-12 space, need to have the structure. And I think that's particularly true of kids who come from families with not a lot of structure or have challenges at home, whether they are kids that are have emotional issues or are homeless or have don't have enough food. I mean, we live in a very diverse, very complicated society, and I think that's the challenge that policymakers have with this kind of education, is how do we adapt it so that we are able to meet the moment, how we are able to do what it is that Julia Young said, which is make sure that the policy decisions are organized around what is the best interest of students, and that the adults are all organized and pulling in the same direction so that these kids can have access to their educational birthright. Because I said at the beginning, the founders were deeply committed to this idea of kids and people of talent being able to rise, that it's a merit-driven society, and that irrespective of person's zip code or background, that they're able to marshal those talents. One of the best examples of that is Alexander Hamilton. And if any of you folks have seen the Broadway show, and it's incredibly inspiring, but his life was incredibly inspiring. He came from remarkably humble background. He was an immigrant on the island of Nevis. No one would have predicted in an era of kings and queens that a guy like Alexander Hamilton was going to be the guy that wrote a majority of the Federalist Papers, that he was going to be the chief assistant during the American Revolution to George Washington, who was going to take on the British Empire, the most powerful empire in the world, and win. a guy who was going to play an instrumental role in framing our Constitution, arguing on behalf of its Constitution, arguing on behalf of the abolition of slavery, and that he was going to be the one that was going to integrate our Constitution, our banking system, our early system of manufacturing, and harmonize that to make the country a lot of what it's become today. And so a guy like Hamilton is one of the greatest success stories, not only of the founding era, but one of the greatest success stories in the whole country. And he is a guy whose humble backgrounds, I think, is a model to all of us about what is possible when, a society based on self-government and ordered liberty is allowed to thrive. So you folks have been incredibly patient and attentive. I'm really grateful again for the opportunity to talk with you today and welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for that riveting and very insightful lecture. And so, as Karen mentioned earlier, the way we're going to take our questions is that you will post them in the chat box, and then I'll read them out, or some of my colleagues will read them out, and then we will, Jamie will answer, and then we'll engage in discussion. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and type it out, and then I'll read it out for you. So as we wait for the questions to come on in, I have a couple of questions myself, and I think I'll just start off from some of the points that Jamie made in the last few minutes of your talk. So, given the work of Julie Young and the clear evidence of the value of innovation in remote learning, I guess my question is, to what extent, and you mentioned the report that you've done in the last few months, to what extent have you taken into account the impact or the implications of the differences in students' socioeconomic backgrounds? And this is something that has come up a lot in debates pertaining to remote learning, even at college level, that, for example, things like internet connection, access to a good, well-functioning, powerful electronic device, be it an iPad or a laptop, and issues of accommodation, right? Some students live in homes where they do not have space to quietly do their work or connect on Zoom without interruptions. So have you done some studies that maybe quantify some of those dynamics and how that impacts educational outcomes with remote learning?
Yeah, it's a great, Shingy, thank you. That's an excellent question. And we actually have a paper that's in the pipeline now on how online learning can meet the needs of kids that are at risk. And that, one of the things I think that Massachusetts has done a good job, or at least some districts have, particularly high need districts, is that they have done that kind of basic accounting of, what's the student population like? What is the background of students? Who's going to need devices? I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but there's literally thousands, even tens of thousands of students where they bought laptops for them and provided laptops for them, and are, in some districts have a kind of it's like a portable router. So they put it on a bus and they drive it around the city to make sure that kids in disadvantaged neighborhoods are having access to it. But it is an enormous challenge, and I think that one of the things about it is that people talk a lot about opportunity gaps or achievement gaps in this country, but one of the big ones is the technology gap. And it's a lot of when the original ed reform law in 1993, when Massachusetts passed that, there were kids that I worked for Boston University. They ran the schools in Chelsea for 20 years. Chelsea is probably the poorest or among the poorest communities in the state, and they were big beneficiaries of state funding. And we have a highly, highly progressive state funding mechanism to make sure that they are trying to bring the funding, that the per pupil funding, up to speed so that more or less the kids in Chelsea are having access to the same kind of education the kids are in Wellesley or Newton. Now we have probably the most progressive funding formula in the country, but the bottom line is we still got a long way to go, and that part of the work in transitioning especially at this time over to remote learning or digital learning is addressing that and making sure that kids of all backgrounds have the technology, they have the supports, so that they are able to do their work, and that, I'm not saying that's easy in a district of, pick Boston, 55,000 student. That requires the district going to super extra lengths to do that. But, in fairness, the Boston Public Schools spend about $22,000 per kid, and which is, almost half of what they do at some of the really high quality Catholic schools in Boston, who are providing similar kinds of opportunities. So, they are. We're not all the way there, but I do feel like we are making progress in that direction. But it's a great question, and I think a valid one about this moment. And because, as I said, it's equal access to education is a birthright in states. That is the obligation of the states. They have to fund it. You cannot have good education without it being properly funded. And it is absolutely imperative that if our democracy is going to mean anything, that kids of all backgrounds have got to have access to excellence.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And Susan Fleming is asking, what was your experience like working with the Chelsea school system at Boston University? You touched a little bit on it, so perhaps you could expand it for Susan.
It was really a great experience, and I'll just give you a kind of thumbnail sketch on it. When I first got out of school, I went to Boston University, and I studied international relations. So I studied history and economics. I took a lot of international economics classes. But the reason why I got interested in education was, aside from my family connections to it, is that I knew that if this country was going to continue to be a democracy, that it was going to be worthy of the term democracy, that it was going to have to do a better job of providing equality of educational opportunity. And if I knew if it was going to continue to be able to compete with China or India or Japan and generate the kind of engineers and be able to compete, that it was going to have to get better at the K-12. And so that's how I got involved with it. In truth, I spent a brief amount of time looking for a job in Washington, D.C. back in 1991 when I graduated. I was offered some jobs there, but I began to realize that actually the action in education is in school districts. And what BU did was the first of its kind, and really the first since that time, where it committed the resources of the fourth largest private university in the country to run a school district. And they did it. They had a enabling legislation that was passed through the legislature, and it gave them control over the school committee's policymaking. They hired the superintendent. They raised millions of dollars, and they brought all of the academic expectations of a high quality university to bear. And, Chelsea today is not Newton or Brookline or a high performing district, but it never slid backwards into what happened in Lowell and Lawrence and a lot of other places where it just, really bottomed out. One of the big things that went with that partnership is that the city itself, and it kind of speaks to self-government, had a state-appointed receiver that took control over the finances because, frankly, there was a lot of corruption. The FBI indicted a bunch of the former mayors and what have you. And that tandem of the state-appointed receiver and the university running the schools, I think, have been enormous in at least stabilizing and beginning to move Chelsea in a much more productive direction. They tend to have dropout rates that are much lower than a lot of the lower performing cities in the state. They built schools for the first time in 100 years. They enacted curricular reforms where the city's about 70-80% Hispanic. The Hispanic students in Chelsea tend to perform much higher than the Hispanic students in a lot of the other school districts that are urban school districts. So they got a long way to go, but it was I think the best of what a private university can do to help provide leadership and guidance to solve public problems, So I don't know, I mean, I'm happy to talk more about it, but it was a great experience, particularly as a young person. And I started off just as an intern and, getting coffee for people and doing a lot of the legwork and the kind of nuts and bolts that's not very glamorous, but it actually really taught me how cities work or don't work, how schools work, don't work. And so I'd encourage you, there are things like Teach for America, which a lot of students, particularly from really good schools like Wellesley, end up doing. But it's the idea of bringing sort of liberal arts, high quality education to bear to address these problems. And I'd encourage, your students to do it and participate in, because we're going to need all hands on deck to solve these problems. They're multi-generational problems, and it's going to require, smart students like the ones that are in your classes to do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. I have another question from Yui Xiong. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Yui is saying there's already much opposition to using student standard test grades to assess teaching. I wonder how the idea of using student graduation results to decide teacher payment would be received.
So that's a great question. So in the original ed reform law, it basically said it was a grand bargain of a lot of money, which a lot of the special interest groups, the teachers unions, the superintendents, the school committees all really wanted, always want more money. You hear a lot of discussion of more money, and that is true and it's important. But then they coupled it together with these really high quality standards. And Massachusetts is one of the few states that has the MCAS test. It's a high stakes test. So you have to pass this test in English and math and science to graduate from high school in Massachusetts. And in fact, there was supposed to have been a history test, and the bureaucracy fought that. One thing that they did not do in Massachusetts is that tie that to teacher evaluations. And I think they felt that the standards and the accountability for the students and for incoming students, they had a high quality teacher test where the teachers were being tested on the same kinds of liberal arts material that the students were expected to know. So if you want to be a history teacher or a math teacher, you can't just have a lot of kind of vague classes in how to teach. You have to know history, you got to know math, you got to know science. And that was different. That was very different. It's still different from a lot of states, which don't generally have very high quality teacher testing. But the way that they tried to uphold and a higher standard for teachers was not necessarily tying teacher evaluations or teacher accountability to student performance. Now, that generally happened because as there was more data out there, policymakers, school committees, superintendents, legislators, and parents could see for the first time how their students were doing. I mean, it really was a sea change that's occurred in the last 25 years where it was data-driven policymaking. I kind of make it, compare it to the difference between, the old pilots used to fly, they were called these barnstormers, and they didn't have any instrumentation. They kind of flew by the seat of their pants and by their gut, but they didn't really know what they were doing, right? They had experience, but they didn't have any instrumentation to tell them how high they were flying or what their, how they were going to land. They kind of instinctively knew how to do it. To, jets today, where it's all instrumentation. They have the data in front of them. They know what they're doing, and they're making decisions based on real data. And that's the difference between the way it was 25 years ago and the way it is now. But generally, I have to say, I have not been in favor of tying teacher evaluations to student testing in an ironclad way. I think that teaching is a very difficult job. It's very labor intensive, and the basic data is enough for people to know. But kids come to classroom with lots of background issues, with lots of gaps in their knowledge, and to hold one teacher accountable for gaps in previous teachers' experiences or kids moving or what have you, I just am not a big fan of that.
And just to build off of that, you mentioned that one of the sort of the core features of Julie Young's model was to tie teacher payment to throughput.
Yes.
Right. So would you kindly speak a little bit on that, particularly with regards to, like you just mentioned, that one teacher sometimes might not be able to account for some of the gaps in the students' learning experience, and also maybe give a sense of how many students per teacher how many students would be given to each teacher in that individualized model.
Yeah, there's no question that the online learning model tends to be smaller numbers of students. And one of the big difference between sort of the traditional public schools and their model is that it's governed by teacher contracts. So the school day is very tightly prescribed. And I'm a big believer. People have a right to organize. Labor has a right to organize. It is a part of the due process. It's part of the freedom of assembly, and the teachers' unions do it well, and they represent their members very well. But I will say sometimes it doesn't always create the flexibility necessary so that it always is tailored to students' needs. Now, the reason why I guess I'm a little more in favor on the online model is they don't have a teacher contract. So teachers are on the hook to be replying to students really at the students' schedule, and that demands a lot more of teachers, without a doubt. But I think because of that, it also requires more accountability too, and so but generally speaking, it tends to be, and Florida Virtual School is one of the few places that has done that. And in truth, I'm not sure they still do it, because one of the things when Julie left, some of the things began to get peeled back, and I would not be surprised whether that got peeled, because it was very controversial, as you can imagine. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I think that the distinction between the traditional public schools with a lot of the contractual limitations and one that doesn't have that, I do think one of the ways to hold teachers accountable who is through that idea of making sure that they're really driving student achievement.
Great. You answered the question very well. Thank you. So now I have a question here from Serhan. I'm just going to read it a little small paragraph. It says, as you mentioned in your talk, we see a critical shift from the traditional liberal arts education model focusing on civic values to a more market-oriented approach that focuses on skills training to meet the needs of the market. So, but then this has some consequences for the young generation. So how do we reimagine or reform the liberal arts education in the modern market-driven economy? So again, like you mentioned, I guess this is from what you mentioned about how there's a refocusing of attention on more vocational skills development than the liberal arts model.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a kind of the central question of the era that we live in, whether you're talking about a higher educational institution that's dedicated to the liberal arts, or in my view, what the K-12 system, which should be deeply, deeply grounded in the liberal arts. That, I think it requires people in the liberal arts to really make the case of why it matters, which I think is actually really easy to do. Going back to the founders and going back to the Enlightenment, we know that a liberal arts education actually over the long haul has the longest shelf life. If you train someone in a particular skill or for a particular moment, we know through technology and we know through the workforce is that people are going to have a lot of jobs in their career. And if you train them for one particular skill or one particular kind of job, it can change, and that's really what happened in this country is that, and you're seeing some of the political ramifications of it, is that for generations, families in Detroit or Ohio or in Wisconsin could count on local manufacturing to provide stability and jobs in their community because the parent and the grandparent, et cetera, had been part of manufacturing steel or wire or what have you. Well, the reality of the global economy has made the countries, it's forced them to be much more nimble. I think the liberal arts education is the best education for a variety of different reasons. First of all, you can never learn how to read well enough or analyze data or numbers well enough or speak well enough or write well enough. They seem like they're sort of 4th century BC skills, and but I think that the lessons that you learn from reading great philosophy or learning great history, they're timeless. And one of the best examples of it, I got to say, comes from Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, his mother was American, his father was a British lord. He was not a particularly good student. I don't think he went to Oxford or even the elite Oxford or Cambridge, but he was a statesman who wrote 40 books. He wrote biographies of his ancestors. He wrote histories of World War II, his experiences in World War I. He was an exemplar of the liberal arts. Now, he was not perfect. All our heroes have feet of clay, but he wrote well, spoke well. And what mattered is that in the definitive moment that defined the 20th century, as his country, and in fact, the Western world was confronting first Nazism and then Soviet communism, he was the guy that had all the background knowledge, the historical knowledge, the philosophical knowledge to explain, not even just to his country, but to the Western world and really even to the United States, what they were fighting for, what it is that is unique about liberal democracy and what is unique about the rule of law and the respect for people of different religions and different racial backgrounds, et cetera, that he explained why, not only why liberal arts matters, but why this heritage in a kind of enlightenment-driven education matters so much. And so I think that the goal, or what the mission of liberal arts institutions and proponents of liberal arts, is to explain why this is a better form of education. It's better suited to self-government and to self-determination, and why it's better for kids of all background to have the knowledge to be able to access the laws, the financial and political institutions that allow them to rise and have fulfilling lives.
Thank you so much. And so I don't see another question here, so I'm just going to ask one more question that I had. So you emphasize the importance of equal access to quality education for folks from all backgrounds, and also the value, even from the perspective of the founding fathers, the value of decentralization and choice from local levels going up. But then there's been some debates going on about what other people term redlining, and the fact that folks cannot cross districts or not send their children to better schools from different districts, but actually result in some areas just being stuck with substandard education. So in some of your work, have you encountered some of those discussions, and if you speak a little bit more on how some of those gaps can be accounted for?
Yeah, no, and let me just punctuate something at the end, from the previous question. So one of the other folks, of course, to look at is, Margaret Thatcher. She also was a product of a liberal arts background. She's a chemist, and it's and first of all, she was, enormously influential and important prime minister, and really, I'm trying to think. I mean, she's really certainly one of the most important women of the 20th century. But she was a chemist, so it doesn't even just need to be the liberal arts. It can be also in the hard sciences, and she brought that kind of tough-mindedness to policy making and to politics that you wouldn't predict necessarily from a scientist. So, yeah, one of the big, nothing is more equalizing from my point of view than choice. We have tons of choices in front of us every day, from the clothes that we wear to where we live, what car we drive, what kind of food we eat. But education is one of those things, or at least education in this country is one of those areas where there's not as many choices as there needs to be. And again, I'd point to higher education, which is choice-driven, totally decentralized. and the envy of the world. And that having students be able to pick what it is that they study, whether it's a vocational course of study or a vocational, whether it's religiously based or vocational or academic or liberal arts, that it makes it dynamic. It makes it so that people that are engaging in the education are not just having it dictated to them, but they get to pick it and choose it. There's no question that, from my point of view, when you look at a state like Massachusetts, which is a very wealthy state, it's a very well-educated state, it has deep, deep pockets of chronic underperformance. And it's not an accident that all these really great charter schools, 90% of them are in urban districts. The people that started those schools, whether they were parents or teachers, or educational leaders, they did it because they were animated to make sure that there was equality of educational opportunity. And one of the big goals of charter schools, and it's true of frankly of Catholic schools too, which are mostly in urban districts, is that they are, one of the best guarantors of people's ability to rise. And the best ways, people always say it about Catholic schooling, is that it's been one of the best anti-poverty programs that has occurred in this country and in this state over the last 100 years, because generally speaking, kids in Catholic schools tend to be lower performing kids that, started off being behind or had disadvantages. But the Catholic schools have been remarkable in moving kids along so that they become successful and have real choices and options in life. But they also are deeply, deeply grounded in the liberal arts. The Catholic education, they really, going back to the medieval era, really help codify and provide more structure to the liberal arts. Again, it's his commitment to literature and poetry and drama and the hard sciences that really give education meaning. Because I think one of the big things that choice does, particularly when people choose, irrespective of the religion that they pick, is that we're really struggling with kids that are struggling to find out why life is worth living. When you see the violence, when you see the drug use, when you see the kind of things that are going on in urban districts, but they're also going on in suburban districts, the despair, the self-destruction of different kids really need to understand why life is worth living. And the liberal arts, because it is grounded in that commitment to great literature, great poetry, drama, they explain what a good life is. And whether it's really high quality Catholic schools or Jewish day schools or really good prep schools, they've been doing this for a long time. Places like Exeter and Andover and Milton Academy, that's what they do. They really try to explain kids, why it's, but they have to be able to pick it. And you see folks like, President Obama came from a difficult background in some respects, single mom largely, but he went to Ponaho. It's like the Phillips Exeter or Phillips Andover of Hawaii. And from there, he went on to be enormously successful academically and go to law school and became president. And, same with the governor of Massachusetts, Deval Patrick. He grew up on the south side of Chicago, single parent family in poverty. He got a scholarship to go to Milton Academy, an elite prep school. From there, he went to Harvard. He went to Harvard Law School. He became successful in politics and business, and then ran for governor. And is an enormously articulate guy. He's an excellent speaker, one of the best speakers I think I've heard in my lifetime. And so, these are examples of success stories, but they had choices. Whether it was through scholarships or whether it was through, we've had certainly many presidents that have gone to elite prep schools. It's that choice that actually helps break up poverty. It breaks up the kind of disadvantages that should not be predictive of how students rise in our society.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I see we are coming really close to the end of the event. And if there's no other question, I think this leaves me to thank you very much, Jamie, for coming to speak to us on this very important and timely topic. And we greatly appreciate your insights, your wealth of knowledge. And I really hope that everybody agrees with me that I'm now extremely well informed and enriched by this discussion. So thank you again, Jamie, and thank you so much to everybody for attending this event. And I wish you an enjoyable evening. Good night.